find out about the Magic Ladder program that I know some of you already have been exposed to. But David Bolton, he will tell you about himself and about the program, but the bottom line is it will be free to you, an online reading program to help struggling readers. And the reason that I'm asking that you make sure that you sign this sign-in sheet and that you get the first part of your email, because I'm asking for your name and district, and the first part of your email is so that when the date is set for the actual electronic online training, you get that information first and can talk to your principals or district administrators about coming. So that will be set up for this fall. So it is very, very important that you sign this sign-in sheet. And where is that in the process right now? Who has it? Okay. Who has not signed? If you'll hold your hold on. What we may have to do is I may have to put it up here on the end of the stage and make sure before you leave that you sign it, okay? We'll keep passing as much as we can. Well, I'm going to shut up and I want to introduce David Bolton, who is actually the creator or co-creator, I'm not sure, he'll explain all of that to you, of the Magic Ladder program for struggling readers.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Carol. I really appreciate the welcome and you're asking me to be here. Great. And thank you all. I know that you had a choice about whether you want to be here or not. I appreciate you choosing to be here. So thanks for that. So as Carol said, my name is David Bolton. Oops. I consider myself a learning activist. That is part learning theorist, part technologist, part activist in the sense that I'm trying to change how people think about learning. I'm trying to redefine what learning means to our population. And it's in the pursuit of that bigger mission. I'll put this echo that we focused on reading, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. And then it's out of the work that we've done on reading that this Magic Ladder project has developed. So let me give you a little bit of a background. Not that anything about me is that important to what I'm going to say, but just so you know where I'm coming from. 30-something years ago, I was the president of a Silicon Valley high-tech startup that made robots that made the internal parts of personal computers during the beginning of all of that. A few years after being quite successful at it, I started to wonder if the old myth, the guy who dies with the most toys wins, started to wear off on me, and I didn't want to do that anymore. And I went on what could only be described as a learning binge that lasted for about a year. And during the course of this learning binge, I studied all kinds of things. But what it ultimately led me to was learning about learning. I was really stunned. I kind of grown up thinking somebody out there knows what I'm talking about, the kind of get it so vibe that's inside of everything you read. It's like we know it, it's done, right? What I found in my learning binge is that when I learned my way into the edge of quantum physics or the edge of some philosophical dispute or some anthropological dispute or whatever it was, the closer you got to the edge of what the scientists were really doing, the more that it was a mystery, the more that it wasn't solved, the more that it wasn't known, the more that there was a raging debate about what was true. Yet, even up on the surface, it's always, that's the way it is, it's done. So I realized that learning is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is the scaffolding for learning, but it's not more important than learning. Learning is much more important than knowledge. I came to realize that anybody could learn anything if who or what they were learning from could meet them on the edge of their learning with what they needed to stay in it. Right? I'm not talking about the neurobiologically, innately disordered, disabled, right? The small percentage of kids that are in that category. But for the vast majority of the human population, any human could learn anything if they were interested in it, and who or what they were learning from could meet them on the edge of their learning with what they needed to stay in it. Yeah? Everybody. And it seemed to me that it was kind of criminal that the world didn't work that way. Like, why isn't that the way that we educate? Why isn't that the way we learn? So I embarked on a project and developed a new form of publishing system back in the late 80s that was based on those designs, and developed one of the first electronic books ever built. It brought me to the attention of Apple Computer, where I worked at Apple Computer for a couple of years, and I designed their first virtual university. It was which was an electronic campus that taught Apple employees whatever they needed to learn in order to be effective on their jobs. During the course of this, I was focused on learning on the other side of reading, meaning that we already assumed somebody could read, and now we're talking about conducting their learning with reading, right? So I was on the other side of it. It never occurred to me, the problem of reading. So one day, my 5-year-old son comes home from school, who was a master with computers. He was linguistically marvelous. I mean, his kindergarten teacher said this kid got the vocabulary of a 20-year-old. He was verbally bright, right? Him and I could communicate super well. And he comes home from school one day, because I never explicitly tried to teach him to read. He comes home from school one day, and he's got a book in his hand, and he points at the words in the book, and he says, "It can't be that way. It can't be that way, Dad." He was used to computers and video games and other things that were coherent and intelligible, right? He had this powerful vocabulary, had this quick mind, and he hit the confusion that's in the correspondence between letters and sounds in our language, and he just couldn't believe it. How could it be like that? He was stunned, and in his stunnedness, he conducted me into experiencing the challenge of learning to read from the perspective of a young, bright mind. And I saw what he saw. It was ridiculously, obscurely confused. How the heck could it be that way? So at the time, this was 1990, I invented a little system, which I call orchestrating reading. And for any of you that are interested, I have a little booklet on it that I'll send you. And within a week, he was off and running. Boom. But he was bright, fast, on he went. I wrote a paper about it. I shared it with some of my colleagues. Most of the teachers thought it was from Mars. What are you talking about? This is the way we teach reading. You all seen that, right? So I kind of let that bury in the back of my mind. And off I went on to my general learning work, and I got involved back with Apple, forming my own software companies, working with MIT's Organizational Learning Center, other projects related to learning, and let the reading thing just kind of drift into the background. Then 10 years later, a little daughter, and she has the same experience when she first starts to encounter learning to read that my son did, right? But she has an auditory memory processing deficit. She can't remember sound in the same way. She's got a weakness there. So as a consequence, she can learn to work out a word, get it, and then have to do it all over again one sentence later, right? And no matter what I did, there was no way to persuade, convince her that this wasn't her fault. She just withered on the vine in front of me. She just died into this pool of shame, feeling so bad about herself as a learner, as a kid, as a student, etc., right? And that's when I committed to back to reading, right? That reading was the obstacle. And I began this process of studying reading. Over the course of the next decade, by the way, I will show this. One day when she was 5 years old, I have multiple systems here, so there'll be a little clumsiness as I switch back and forth between the different modes that I'm going to share with you. One day, she's still 5 years old, and one day, and I'm still thinking about this confusion, this mess, how many kids are affected. I'm starting to make contact with national leaders, some of which I'll show you interview pieces with, and having discussions about reading and what I would call what's at stake. What's at stake for children that are struggling with learning to read, both for the individual child and for society as a whole. And what's involved? What is it about reading that's so difficult? Why is it that 60% of the population of kids in this entire country, not just here, across the board, are chronically improficient, meaning day after day, week after week, month after month, they're not good enough at learning something, right? And they're learning that they're not good enough about learning something, and that's poisoning their whole learning capacity in life, right? Anyway, before I got to that, my daughter and I were at a garage sale, and she comes up to me with this book. I've been a John Steinbeck fan. Everybody knows John Steinbeck. Grapes of Wrath and all kinds of other books that he wrote. Okay. So, anyway, I said, John Steinbeck, King Arthur story. What's that about? And I referred right there in this garage sale. I opened this book up, and that's the first words of the book. So that and my daughter's plea got me focused on reading. This is the continuation of what I had to say. So over the course of the next 10 years, I interviewed the 100 top scientists and scholars who had some unique angle of view, some unique understanding about something to do with reading. Some of them were anthropological linguists that were studying where the letter Z came from. The guy at Harvard, that's what he did. He thought where the letter Z came from. He was really big in the Harvard world because of that. There were people that were neuroscientists studying how the sound circuitry in the brain worked. There were, I met with the head of the Institute of Educational Science in Washington, D.C., who was Assistant Secretary of Education for the United States Department of Education, who was responsible for the science of education for the country, right? I met with the czar of reading, the purpose of the report of the Congress and the presidents. So I got the research perspective, I got the neuroscience perspective, I got the psychological perspective, I got all these different angles of view, right? And when it's all said and done, there was 1,000 hours of conversations, right? And it all boils down to just a couple of simple statements, which we're going to use to unpack what I'm going to say today. Everybody heard of Louisa Moats? Okay. She's probably one of the top 5 most renowned reading theorists, practitioners. She's the mind behind the kind of national efforts. She used to work at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development.
The problem is our society's lack of insight into what is involved in acquiring literacy.
So 1,000 hours in, talking to all these people, and probably the most respected brain in the world of this basically says the problem is we think we understand what reading is and we don't. It's the way we look at what's going on in a struggling reader. This was confirmed by another great interview with the head of this was the guy who was the reading czar I mentioned.
If I had my brothers, instructional methods wouldn't be the big deal out there. What would be the big deal is if teachers could ask themselves, what does it take to learn to read?
So here was the guy that was the responsible party for spending tens of millions of dollars on research, who was the primary driver of phonics at the policy level from Washington, D.C. around the country. And despite being an advocate for phonics and particular ways of teaching, he said on reflection, based on his 25 years of work in the space, that rather than getting teachers to follow some system of teaching, he would rather that they ask themselves authentically, first person, what does it take to learn to read? Because there's no substitute for how a teacher or somebody who's going to be conducting children through this rough terrain, there's no substitute for whether they're learning their way in, right? If they're following some script, they're going to help some kids and they're going to hurt other kids. There's no substitute for their own first-person learning. And that's our takeoff point. So a couple of housekeeping things before I get on to the more formal aspects of this. So as Carol said, we're not going to have a break unless at about an hour or something in enough of you start to leave, and I'll say, oh, we'll stop and have a break, okay? You're used to presentations, if you're used to them at all, when somebody comes up with a clicker, there's next slide, next slide, next slide, okay? But what I have here is 10 different slideshows that are all interconnected, right? And a series of things that are outside the slideshow universe themselves. And so I'm going to be jumping around all over the place because I never do anything in some kind of linear fashion. It's kind of, I want to learn from you. That's going to change how I do things. And so bear with me as I jump over. I seem to jump around a bit. The stuff on the screen is kind of a talking prompt to support you unless it's a video. So there's nothing you need to worry about reading or capturing in that sense. Just, if you like to learn auditorily, just track with what I'm saying, right? And we'll stop and we'll have questions both as we're unfolding and at the end. And there will be some visual things to support you along the way. Relative to taking notes, like I said, you really don't need to do that if you're willing to do this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's see if we.
So this is a little feedback card with an address on the back of it. And if you go there, there's a little form that you can fill out. And when you fill out that form, but I think are most important based on the feedback that I get from you, and to the extent that you're interested, there's both this booklet that I will send you, and at the end of this, those of you that stick around and ask questions and come up, I brought with me 30 video tapes, 30 DVDs, excuse me, and I'll be giving those to the people that stick around and that engage with me, okay? And if something's burning, just raise your hand. We'll have to talk about it. Another caveat is that I'm not here to sell you anything. You heard talk about the Magic Ladder coming in the fall. That's a totally nonprofit project. I don't have an ideology to sell. I don't have a product to sell. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm trying to conduct you on a ride into learning about this. And for those of you that really aren't interested in learning about this, this is going to be a waste of time. You know, this is not a how-to session. This is let's go deep together and understand the problem so that from that depth of understanding, we can better differentiate the various things we're doing, whether we're teaching in some existing system or we're using the Magic Ladder, which I'm going to show you. So let me start with a couple of questions. First of all, what is reading? Anybody want to share their conception? What is reading? What is it? Getting a message from written symbols. Okay? Anybody else? What's so difficult about getting the message from written symbols? So much brain activity at once, and it doesn't make any sense. Well, that's tracking pretty good with me. Anybody else got anything different than that? Anything in their description of what reading is? Or what the problem is? Is that because you really don't have anything different to say, or is that because you don't want to raise your hand? That not wanting to raise your hand is something we're going to go down into later, because that's the biggest thing hurting these kids. It's the same version, their version of that. So,
to learn to read with this new magical technology, to be able to arrange the letters in the right order, to actually, conjure, as it were, that thing that you just spelled. It was experienced by all the people who had not met the written word before. When they first encounter it, they experience it as magic, as a very powerful form of magic.
Black Robe, what you do?
Making words.
Words? You don't speak.
I will show you.
So what?
Something I didn't know.
My woman's mother died in snow last winter. What am I? Blackie. I said,
Hey, that's Jim. You want me, Mom? You want to walk?
Last winter, Shamina's wife's mother died in the snow.
Without seal.
I always take that as WTF in Indian. So, reading is a relatively new thing in the face of the earth, right? Let me go back to the first point. What is reading? Most people have a kind of romantic idea of it as being some kind of natural extension of speech. But if you break it down, if you think of the experience of reading itself, what is reading, what's going on when we're reading, our brain is functioning like a machine, and it is extracting information in terms of instructions and content from a code, and then transforming that into a projection up into our consciousness that sounds to us like we're talking to ourselves. It is as artificial as a toaster or a microwave or anything else. It's a total machine. It just happens to grow in our brain instead of outside. Right? And there's a lot of things that can cause that machine to not grow right, to not grow well. This is not just my opinion. I'll show you a couple of other things. Maybe I'm wrong.
Learning to read an alphabetic orthography is a very artificial and unnatural act.
It's one of the most complex, unnatural, cognitive interactions the brain and environment have to coalesce together to produce. It's amazing.
The alphabet is a technology in the sense that it's a contrived device for conveying information.
It is in a sense a technological artifact, absolutely.
When we read, we take in code, we get a set of instructions, and we perform cognitive processes.
I think of it, another way to think of this is it's a simulated language machine. It's simulating language. It's constructing, fabricating a simulation of language. It's kind of an artificially inseminated language experience, reading this. One way to go even further into it that I think helps explain some of the cognitive mechanics of it is to think of it, remember the old player pianos where they got a scroll? Anybody remember that? Some of you do. Remember, some of you are not sure. Okay. Instead of the player pianos that were in pool halls and pizza joints and everything around the country were self-entertaining, right? You didn't have to have somebody play the piano. You had the piano playing be heard in the place. And so they had this little scrolls that would result in the piano playing with nobody there. Keys moving the whole thing, right? So this code is being interpreted by this machine in a way that the little punches on it result in keys happening on the piano keyboard that results in intelligible music to your ear, right? But imagine what happens if one of the keys is stuck. The intelligibility starts to fall off. Imagine what happens if the whole thing runs too slow. The intelligibility falls off. Imagine if the thing that's reading the hole punches in the code on the scroll doesn't work just right. The intelligibility drops off. And in that sense, the player piano model is a metaphor for what happens to kids, right? Where any number of weaknesses, to your point earlier about how many different parts of the brain are involved, any weakness in any one area, not necessarily an inherent weakness, it could be a learned weakness, right? Any weakness can cause this assembly to stutter, right? To not move fast enough, to not be intelligible enough, and the whole reading thing breaks down.
70% approximately of young African American kids can't read. 70%. If you look at Hispanic, 65, 70%.
And as we know, a majority of students do not read at the proficient level.
93 million adults out of a total adult population of around 221 million are at basic literacy levels or below basic.
Let me explain the distinction. Everybody's familiar with basic and proficiency in your schools, right? And what they were just talking about was basic, not proficiency, right? When it comes to proficiency, as you heard Wendorf say from the National Center for Learning Disabilities, comes to proficiency, 2/3 of the kids in this country, and roughly the same number here, are below proficient, right? So what's the difference? With basic, it means that you can struggle out to get word recognition, right? But you can't read with the kind of flow or depth or transparency or ease so that you can have the comprehensional reflection to really be able to make the reading process transparent. Proficiency means that the brain work of reading is transparent to the mind work of learning from what you're reading. That make sense? The brain work of reading is now invisible, and it's just like talking and listening. It's transparent to learning to reading. 2/3 of the kids in this country, and roughly 2/3 of the kids in the entire, I'm going to have to find one little square here, of the KVEC kids, right, are in the same category. So most of the kids that you see running through your classrooms, right, are improficient. The brain work of reading is not allowing the content to be transparent to their learning. So everything about what's going on in education that depends on the reading is being obscured, made more difficult by the reading difficulty. I say all this because before we go into what's at stake and deconstruct reading a little bit more, it's important to understand the gravity of this. This is not just the kids that are grossly unable to read. We're talking about most kids having some degree of trouble with it that's interfering with their educational success trajectory. Most. It matters for lots of reasons. I'm going to touch on just a few of these things.
When I mess up, I'm pretty much saying it's like, you gotta do it, and it's, if you don't, you know, it's just like, it seems like it's the end of the world. Those who are literate can make it in life. Those who are illiterate don't make it in life.
In our society, literacy is bound up in virtually everything we do. It's hard to imagine getting through a day without having to read. I have an assignment I give to my graduate students that I make them keep a diary for 2 weeks of everything that involves literacy that they do. And I have to write down the time of the day, what it was, and what the piece of material is. A lot of students can't finish the assignment. They can't get through the day. They can't drive in their car. They can't walk into a store. They can't do anything without being embedded in literacy and having to read for some for some reason or other.
Lack proficiency in reading, that it's hard to be self-actualized, it's hard to have a decent job, it's hard. So much is difficult. If I read a book and I feel like a lot's learning.
Does reading make you smart? The answer is yes. Crystallized intelligence is just massively built
by reading itself, okay? Independent of education, independent of fluid intelligence.
Ultimately, the measures of your cognitive abilities tend to move down in the direction of your reading abilities.
Reading isn't just about the acquisition of information. It also becomes the principal gateway to the acquisition of new language.
Well, after fourth grade, or during fourth grade and beyond, vocabulary now enters through print. It doesn't enter through hanging out with your friends on the corner.
If vocabulary is going to grow after the fourth grade, then necessarily you have to be exposed to such words. The factors are just enormous. It's 5 to 1, 10 to 1, 20 to 1, that a written source is going to give you more of just those exposures.
Multiple exposure to words builds vocabulary. As vocabulary grows, you enhance your capacity to participate in all of this content area discussion. Science, social studies, history. All of this is going around you now, and you're increasingly being left out. If you're not even if you're a non-reader, if you're a poor reader, if you're a kid who chooses not to read, if you're the kind of youngster that is never going to pick up a book and is going to put it down as soon as you can after someone puts it in your hand.
We looked at exposure and to other media, okay, electronic media, television, reading, again, educational level, intelligence. If crystallized knowledge is part of your concept of intelligence, and it is for 90% of the theorists out there, then in fact reading does make you smarter.
I'm going to cut some of these off short because they're longer than I have time to play out. As I mentioned before, there's 135 videos in this one segment. They're all free online. Okay, so if you go to my website, you can navigate these whole things, and there's also about 5,000 paper-page equivalents of in-depth interviews with the scientists and scholars I talked with, all free to go in and peruse and to use. Some of this stuff is really helpful to show kids, particularly the things I'm showing, which I'll come to. All right, so in addition to the obvious things, what was implicit in what they were just saying is that reading represents a unique form of cognitive linguistic exercise, right? It's an exercise environment that's causing the brain, or challenging the brain to process abstractly, to process units, symbols, at very high speeds, which we'll come to as we go on, right? And so kids that are not getting enough reading exercise, their brains are not getting exercised. Their brains are not getting exercised in a way that's critical for their success, beyond reading. Right? It's not just that they can't read, it's that their brains aren't being exercised in a lot of other ways that can be helpful to them.
What must it be like to come to school every day? Right? And school is going to be all about the thing that you don't do well.
Spending any amount of time in classrooms where children are working on beginning reading instruction, you can almost watch children who are struggling begin to turn off and exhibit behaviors that are going to interfere with their learning.
I remember feeling pretty dumb.
I wasn't smart. I thought I was not smart because I couldn't read like everybody else did.
Growing up, I had a commute the whole time. I thought something wrong with me.
The spiral starts, and the learning problems get more intense, the emotional overload gets more intense. And you can see a child literally start off being fine, begin to wither on the vine as they begin to struggle at school and lose so much of their self-esteem in the process.
This emotional danger is directly connected to the social danger that kids get into.
I struggle with reading, and if I mess up, or if I feel like I'm about to mess up, I'll start to cry. I'll get angry. I'll just get mad at everybody in the world just because I don't know how to read.
What happens to you when you can't trust your own brain to take care of this reading? And what are the kind of defense mechanisms you might develop? Attention problems, impulsivity, acting out, being the class clown. Anything is better in many ways for your self-esteem self-esteem and your sense of well-being than believing that you can't trust yourself to even process the information in your book. It's very scary.
I think the main thing to emphasize for anyone who has worked with a child or with an adult who has a reading problem, either is low literate or is just struggling with reading, is that it's very apparent that the lost human potential, the lost self-esteem, that's the most poignant. And in the end, it's the most significant because the loss of self-esteem and is what leads to a whole host of social pathologies.
Every public major concern has a much higher incidence of reading problems attached to it, from juvenile delinquency to teen pregnancy, to failure to graduate from high school, to drug problems. You take anything that is, that we say is a major concern, and there's a higher than expected incidence by far of individuals who have struggled with reading or have a frank learning disability.
And there is a line to be drawn between low literacy skills and those social pathologies.
The reading problem affects our health. One study that we got into about this showed that the healthcare costs in this country are about almost $2 trillion now. Some 40% of that, close to $1 trillion, is attributed to mistakes made by patients in taking their medicine, following the doctor's advice, or avoiding it altogether because of their shame or inability to read. Right? The economic costs of the reading problem are greater than our war on terror and drugs combined. The federal government and the state governments combined to spend about $300 million a year just on remedial education related to reading. Right? And as you know, almost everything about elementary school is about getting kids up into reading. Right? If they don't, the rest doesn't matter. There's studies that show that the consumer behavior, people that are low literate, that have low levels of literacy, and that are ashamed of their minds, which I'm going to come to later as we talk, what I call mind shame, right? Which is huge. When they walk into a store, they're not looking at the same things that we're looking at. They're looking at how can they get what they need and get out of there without being embarrassed because they couldn't read and do the computations that are necessary to know that they're getting the right things. And there's been studies, scientific studies of this. So the intelligence of our population, the intelligence of our consumer market space, the whole thing is connected to reading.
What's happening to these children in our schools and not learning to read, the second consequences of that throughout their life, and they carry those scars forever.
We create a city the size of Chicago every 2.5 years, filled with kids who never finished high school, no hopers, and pregnant teenagers, kids who are on drugs, push-outs as well as drama. City the size of Chicago every 2.5 years.
If low literacy skills were a dread disease, we would have found effective ways to address it long before now.
If there were chicken pox in this country and it was spreading the way it's spreading through our schools and children's lives, we would just do everything we could to eradicate it. But chicken pox has visible scars. These scars are invisible.
Those are excerpts from what I call "We Have a Problem," which is the first statement. What's at stake? And what I'm trying to do with that first part is just stretch out that we're talking about most of our kids to various degrees. We're talking about something that is causing them to have a maladapted trajectory through school for the rest of their life. We're talking about something that they can't help but feel bad about themselves because of, and that has this radiant effect on all of us. Right? So the next question is, why is reading so difficult? And you mentioned that there's so much involved in the brain. Well, there's a lot of parts to the conversation why is reading so difficult. There's variations in the way that we are wired up genetically that result in some kids having innately ordained learning differences or learning disabilities such that their brains can't fundamentally can't process in the right kind of speed and sequencing that's necessary to take off and read. So there's that. There's the problem with parents. Low literate parents tend to avoid reading and avoid having things around the house to read. And so they model for the children who can't help but imbibe that behavior, this avoidance of reading, this avoidance of being literate in a way that kids pick up on. And actually, because kids can't help but try to take care of their parents. You all realize that, right? The kids are warped around trying to make their parents feel good, right? So when their parents are avoiding literacy stuff, they learn to do that too. Right? So their parents are not educated about ways that they could be talking and engaging their children that would help them. Their parents are not practicing and exhibiting and modeling literate behaviors, right? And they're modeling, in fact, a kind of emotional aversion to doing it the kids are picking up on. So there's a capitulation, a recapitulation through generations of literacy problems. Preschools. One of the most amazing things to me was up until very recently, the Head Start program thought, yeah, let's leave reading for school. Not our problem. It's only in the past few years they recognize they've got to do something about it. They've got to be. The way that I've come to look at it, which is a little preview about Magic Ladder, is that by the time a child is born, they've got a date with an obstacle course wall. Right? If you think of the K-6 elementary curriculum as a obstacle course, the biggest thing in the obstacle course that's preventing more kids from getting through it is the Great Wall of learning to read. Right? And so from the time children are born, they're having experiences that are preparing them or ill preparing them to be ready to tackle that challenge of climbing that wall. And preschools, up until very recently, weren't concerned with it. And even those that are concerned with it today are proceeding from models about what reading is and how to prepare kids to do it that are outdated and not very effective. One of the other things has to do as a consequence of this is exposure, right? So, as I said, not just because of the parents, but for many other reasons, depending on where kids live, the kind of community they're in will vary dramatically on how much print is present. So you can go to Kroger here and Kroger there, and Kroger, you can actually compare the distribution and presence of literacy-related materials to the social economic environments that store is situated in. Which of course makes economic sense from a business point of view. My point is that kids have got this great variation. The other thing that's huge, and I'll talk more about this in kind of part two, is the language gap, right? The kids are coming with all kinds of different language backgrounds, and we are trying to teach them with kind of one system of language. So there's a gap between the language they know and that they use every day with their friends and family and what have you, and the language that they're being asked to learn to read with. Big gap there, right? That's a huge problem. One of the other things is media. Now, most of you are young. I'll tell you a little story. When I was a kid, there were 3 TV stations, right? And some of you can relate to that. 3 TV stations, NBC, ABC, CBS, right? And there were these back channels, UHF they were called, where you put this little rabbit ear thing on and you go like this, and you occasionally get reruns that way. That was it, right? And before that, before the early days of television, the 50s and 60s, it was just radio, right? So my point is that up until very recently, throughout the vast majority of the history of humans reading was the preeminent way to have intellectual stimulation. It was the way that you could get outside your family bubble, that you could enjoy things, whether comic books or science fiction or great literature or whatever it was. Reading was the pathway for everybody. That was the most intellectually rich and stimulating environment there was. Well, that flat isn't true anymore, right? Today, kids have got, 500 or 600 cable channels, and they've got iPods and iPads, and they've got smartphones and laptops and tablets. They've got all this games, all these ways to be intellectually stimulated that doesn't require the same rigor of reading. So I ask you, why does a kid want to read today? Because you tell them it's important, not because it's intrinsically important. Because they can get the satisfaction they want in a million other ways with less work. That's a radical change. What that means is the entire history of how we used to teach reading is irrelevant. Because it was formed in a day when reading had an entirely different motivational drive to it than it does today. Okay, another thing is the reading to learn. Oh, by the way, all of these are videos. I'm kind of giving you the 10-minute video and 15-second soundbite so we can move through this. So, reading to learn, right? As you all well know, by the time you get to the 3rd or 4th grade, there's this big switch that happens. Instead of up to this point, everything's about reading. Oh, it's okay, we're fine, it'll work out. You know, there's this gentle, sweet tone to, you know, let's encourage them to read, right? And then all of a sudden they hit this wall where they're expected to read. If they can't read, school just goes right off the rails. And I've interviewed, again on the website, you'll see a lot of this stuff. I've interviewed a lot of teenagers who speak back to this very point where the switch happened and they just felt like a bug on a windshield. Bang! Smash. There's also, I'll play a couple of parts of this. It's fun.
We seem to go back and forth between the pole of we shouldn't teach the code, or we should teach it in a super simple way that doesn't actually work. It hasn't worked in English for 500 years.
There's the born-again phonics people. There's the reborn-again whole language people. And they're actually more like cults than religions.
Why do people dichotomize phonics and whole language? Why do they look at qualitative versus quantitative methodologies? Why do they look at cognitive versus social emotional development? The common theme is a lack of knowledge. What pervades those dichotomies is a lack of understanding and goes directly to how we prepare professionals in education. There is no reason why that kind of concrete thinking should exist, but it does.
There's a, everybody heard direct instruction? You heard that? Okay. I had the opportunity to spend about 6 hours interviewing the person who's behind direct instruction, and he has a way of describing all this. He says that the biggest problem with reading problems in the United States is dysteachia. That's what he calls it, dysteachia. But I think this is a problem. One of the things that I found in Washington, and I found with a lot of these experts, is they tend to pin the problem as if the problem's the teacher's problem. As if the teachers are making a mistake. As if it's all the teacher's fault. That all the kids would be fine if the teachers just do it the right way. Which is a load of crap. The heart of the problem is confusion.
Some people there are who, being grown, forget the horrible task of learning to read. It is perhaps the greatest single effort that the human undertakes, and he must do it as a child.
I mean, here the kid grew up in his whole life. He never saw an object change its name when it changed its position. And yet, this is B. Is it B now? No. Is it B now? Yes. Is it B now? No. Is it B now? No. Is it B now? Yes.
We're talking about children experiencing a form of confusion that's unnatural to the world.
I think that's an interesting and good way to frame things.
Well, yeah, the English writing is a mess.
The alphabet that we use to write English now was not created for English. It was created for Latin.
The English language has about 40 different phonemes that are significant, by which we mean sound values that your ear picks up in order to make the distinctions that make meaning. Our alphabet only has 26 symbols, and so therefore we're always compromised in certain areas by having to represent sounds with symbols that weren't designed to suit those sounds.
If that requires doubling up letters and having other letters serving as markers to tell you what sound a particular letter is supposed to have.
So we get GHs and THs and PHs that are supposed to sound like Fs. These things are, there to represent these sounds that don't have their own letters.
There are all these complexities.
It's a real puzzle, and it's a very arbitrary exercise in orthography to figure out what's what.
C, O, ow, wa, oo, M, P, P, A, R, I, E, S, Z, O, wa, oo, N,
My brain, I can't understand what it's saying. My brain is good, my head's good. It's like it kept on just beating. I didn't even try to hurt. I don't even know what's going on in my head.
Very difficult, like putting sounds to these symbols, knowing the difference between one and another, knowing that some are numbers and some are letters, and that you can put them together and they form a completely different thing.
I knew letterings. It was like the sounds and the bigger words, and the words that like when you sound them out, they aren't pronounced the way they sound. I get confused a lot because I'll sit there and I get frustrated. It's no fun. I don't like reading.
I mean, I'm sounding them out like I've been taught, but it just ain't, I don't know, it just don't work. Because, they tell you to sound out, and then, you get vowels, and some of them are silent, and it's just like, well, these two work together to make this thing, and it's like, huh? And then it's just like, it's so confusing.
Well, in English,
There are lots of reasons why English is sleepy.
Inconsistencies, absurdities, facts contrary to the etymology that show up in the writing system. It's a mess.
English seems to be a total monster.
Why do I have one tooth and several teeth, and I go into a restaurant and sit in one booth and there aren't several teeth?
Who came up with E-N-O-U-G-H spells enough?
The world makes every sound under the sun in different words in English. Like other, off, of.
Like F, I don't hear F making sounds very often, and it doesn't, in fact. It only does it in of.
To spell vote, T-H-O-U-G-H is madness.
It would have been much more sensible just to use an R for what we use, I-R, E-R, U-R, A-R, and O-R to represent.
How come the and k are two different letters, but ba and ba are not? I mean, what are the rules here? Where are you going to divide this up?
I don't know of anything that has more exceptions than reading in English.
And I think that's a shame. I think it was a design error, basically. I mean, I see no reason for it to be that way.
Now, we learn as children, and we're, brought into a cultural environment where we become habituated to those relationships. But there's nothing natural about it, nothing at all.
That forms a big part of what we're working on, is to get rid of that confusion, process that confusion in a different way. And I will show you work done by brain scientists who track eye movements that show the speed of processing and reveals what a nightmare challenge this is for a young brain. But at this stage, the point to take away is that there's really three factors, right, that determine how well somebody's going to do with reading. One is their whole early life learning trajectory and how well that's prepared them to be ready for the cognitive linguistic challenge of taking off with reading. Then there's the confusion implicit in the reading, which is connected to a lot of different things, including whether they have the vocabulary background, because that's what exercises phonemic differentiation. That's also what gives them something so that if they did decode a word, they'd be able to recognize it, right? So there's all of that. But there's another piece to this, which is just as big. And for all of you that work with kids that have been struggling for more than a year or so, with this, 6 months to a year or so, the problem isn't any longer the fundamental reading problem. It's the shame. It's the fact that no matter what else we can say about this, we somehow cause the child to feel. It's almost like an unintentional conspiracy that we all participate in. Parents, siblings, peers, teachers. The child can't help but think, something's wrong with me, because I can't do this.
Why does our analysis always come down to, well, let's fix these kids?
This guy, Galen Alessi, did this paper in which he diagnosed diagnosis. And what he did was, he took case studies for about 1,000 kids that were diagnosed as having specific learning disability. So he presented those who provided the diagnosis with a number of questions, like, why are kids diagnosed? And he had a whole bunch of options, including inappropriate teaching, school program, failure to identify problems in a timely manner. And it was never any of the above. It was always the kid. The kid was always the problem, and never was the establishment responsible for the problem.
We keep looking for the source of the problem in the child. What's the deficit in the child? Damaged neurology, a lack of motivation, bad home environment, small vocabulary, attention deficit disorder.
The vast majority of the assessment that occurs is focused almost entirely on the child. So failure is localized at the level there's something wrong. As if there's something wrong with the child, and only with the child.
Rather than
there might not be something wrong. Right, with the system, with the curriculum that the district's chosen, with the way that the instruction is delivered in that particular classroom, with the way the parents have responded to the student's failure. There are all of these other parties that share a role in shaping this child's behavior. And that's not to suggest that it's necessarily productive or useful to point fingers at anyone, but it's certainly unfair to assume that all of the responsibility for that failure rests on that child's head, the person least equipped to bear the responsibility.
It's always put me in a point where I always felt, stupid.
They're frustrated, they're afraid of it, and they do all kinds of things. Deciding that they're stupid, deciding that school is stupid.
When children don't learn in school, they don't really look at anything else as they grow into adulthood. They don't blame anything else. They don't think it was the code. They don't think it was the home environment in which they came from. They don't think it was anything about, any outside influence. It was them. They couldn't do it. They couldn't learn.
And the thing that makes me ashamed of myself is because I went to a good school and had those teachers and all that, but I still struggle with reading and all that.
It's the most amazing thing to me. I interviewed so many kids, and there's no way they can avoid it. They can't help but blame themselves. That led me to another whole dimension of work. I'll just touch on it for a moment, which is this thing I mentioned before about mind change. All of us are wired, our emotional circuits are wired to cause us to avoid the things that cause us to feel really bad about ourselves, right? So, maybe our teeth are too crooked or yellow, and so we stop smiling, right? Or we don't think we sing well enough, and we're not going to sing in public. Or we don't think, we should, whatever it is, you know what I'm talking about? We're all ashamed of some aspect of ourselves, and we can't help but try to cloak it, hide it, avoid it, right? Because that's the way our emotion system works. So what happens when learning causes you to feel bad about yourself? What happens to your learning? I submit to you that more than any problem, including the reading problem, the biggest single problem for most kids in school is they're learning to be ashamed of their minds. And because they learn to feel ashamed of their minds, they feel chronically bad. They come up with self-explanations like, I'm stupid, I'm not smart, I'll never be anything in life, because that relieves the pain of the shame by accepting it. The point about reading is it's the biggest single cause. Math is the same business, right? Although math is coherent, right? Math can be is implicitly, internally more coherent than writing system is. No question about it, right? But the problem of the math avoidance, how many people love to do math? Okay, not many. This is a classroom full of educators, right? So you think that those of you that didn't put your hand up and say, I like math, have found that you didn't like math because you were born that way? No, you learned to not like math because learning math caused you to feel bad about yourself. And feeling bad about yourself because of math made you not want math and pull back from it, which made it more difficult to learn. And now you get to the point when I ask you the question, two of you put your hands up. This is the big problem in education. Bigger than all the rest of the stuff. It's the elephant in the room, right? These kids are learning to be ashamed of their minds in the context of us teaching them what we think is important for them to learn. And that's the context of the reading conversation. Okay, so 3 things, right? Readiness, confusion, shame. And for kids, again, for kids that are in 4th grade and 5th grade and they're struggling, if you can't reframe their experience so they have some hope that gets past their shame will sabotage their ability to learn. And dealing with their shame is more important than teaching them the code because it's obscuring their ability to learn the code. So if you can't read the shame in them and work with it, you can't be helpful. You're going to be statistically helpful for a few kids that your technique fits for, but you're not going to be able to differentiate what you're doing in a way that actually connects and supports and makes them feel hopeful in being able to get through that shame. Any more than whatever you're ashamed about, somebody being able to trivialize your helping you through it. Okay, due to time, I'm only going to touch on this next part. I said readiness is a big part of this. Kids have radically different early life learning trajectories, right? There's been a study done. How many of you heard of the Hart Risley reports? Or how about the 30 million word gap? Okay, a few of you. I still can't tell whether there's an aversion to put your hands up and engaging with me that's kind of like the shame stuff we were just talking about, or whether or not you really, Anyway, I encourage you to be more participative. The study, the 30 million word study, showed that the kids coming into kindergarten can have such a vast difference in word exposure. Right? What they did was they created an artificial situation where a family that was about to have a baby would learn to work with a researcher the researcher would come once a week for 1 hour and rotate around so they got a cross-sectional view of life in the home. They would meet with the parents at the time of birth, but they wouldn't actually come into the house until the kids were 9 months old, right? When the kids were 9 months old, they would come in and they would record every word that went back and forth between the kids and the family, right? Then they added it up. When they added it up, they found that some kids are coming out of environments that are more taciturn, less talkative, right? And that those kids, if you looked at the amount of word exposure they're getting, by the time they get into kindergarten, they've maybe heard 12 or 13 million words. Kids that come out of families whose parents talk because they make their living with their mouth, in the sense of being lawyers or doctors or whomever, or teachers that are talking all the time, those kids would come into kindergarten with 45 to 50 million words. Every word exposure is a cognitive, linguistic, and emotional experience exercise. So the differences in the income of kids with respect to this vocabulary exposure was just vast. And when you carry it across, statistically, it accounts for the entire variation in kid performance in elementary school. This wasn't their fault. Right? This exposure wasn't their fault at all. And yet, their trajectory is being determined largely by whether or not they were talked to and engaged. Right? How many of you are telling the parents you're working with that the most important thing they can do is engage in turn-taking dialogue that pulls a child's mind into language? How many of you do that? You do? Okay, good. Yeah. Everybody should do that. Because there's nothing that will help the children more than getting that kind of attention at home early on. Because that sets them up. That exercises phonemic differentiation to understand the sounds. That exercises, it develops vocabulary. It develops a kind of emotional trust in the processing of language. It develops speed of processing, all that stuff, right? So, that's one dimension. when you think about reading, reading requires not only the things I just mentioned, it requires, for reasons that I just spoke to relative to shame, it requires emotional perseverance, it requires resiliency, it requires frustration tolerance. Right? If the kids hit the wall with this frustration, and they're gonna, just like my bright 5-year-old did, right? They're gonna hit that wall. Do they have the confidence in themselves that they can learn their way through it? If they don't get through it, what they learn is that they can't trust learning to get through things. And once that happens, what happens to their life? What would happen to your life if you couldn't trust learning to get you through your problems? All right, there's a lot of other things in here. There are studies of brain science that show that from the moment we are born, we are adapting to our environment. So, for example, babies that are around mom and dad that are talking a lot, right, will actually come out fast to take off and learn to read. They're actually listening from the womb, right? It's phenomenal. From the moment the organism starts to form. The brain itself isn't assembled by a hardwired template. It's assembled by genetic expressions that are controlled by the adaptation that's going on in the baby's environment. Even the brain is learned into being, not formed in some mechanical way. So there's a whole thing on readiness. All these videos are available online. So we talked about shame. Then I'm going to give you a more grounding example of this.
The other kids could make the books talk. They picked the books up and words would come out. He said, to me, it just looked like lines and circles and squiggles. I had no idea where the words were. The teacher began hassling me because I wasn't able to read. And by the end of October, the kids were making fun of me because I couldn't read. And I realized it wasn't going to be too long before my mom and dad found out that I wasn't doing my job. He said, so I was scared. I was really scared. He said, but I was also a real resourceful kid. And I looked around the room and I noticed there was another kid in class who couldn't read. This kid couldn't read a lick. And yet nobody made fun of him because he couldn't read. Even the teacher didn't hassle him because he couldn't read. Because he was deaf. Or hearing, he had a hearing loss. And because he was deaf, no one expected him to read on time. He said, so I figured in my 6-year-old mind, the solution to my problem was to convince everyone that I was deaf. And if I could convince everyone I was deaf, they'd stop hassling me about the reading. He said, so I went on a one-man campaign to convince everyone in my life that I couldn't read. He said, and everything was fine until June. I said, well, what happened in June? He said, my mom and dad sat me down the last day of school in June in the 1st grade and said, Dan, we're really worried about your hearing. You don't seem to be able to hear. We take you to hearing doctors and audiologists all over Cape Cod. Nobody can figure out what it is. So we make an appointment with you. And you're going to go to Boston Children's Hospital next week. And you're going to stay there for 4 days and 3 nights. And they're going to do exploratory ear surgery and have your adenoid surgically removed. And this 6-year-old kid went through 3 days of surgery rather than tell his parents what was done. Can you imagine the trauma of a 6-year-old child going through surgery that only he knows he didn't need?
This guy's really famous in LD circles. And he told one other story. I'll just give you a quick view of. It was this kid who had a really violent father who would beat him up, just beat him to a pulp on just about anything. And bottom line of this is that he would take the beating from his father rather than the shame of reading in the classroom. So he'd go to the classroom and opt out of reading in a way that his parents would get notified his father would beat him up, and he would rather have the beating every night than the shame of being in that classroom and being exposed for not being able to read. You would not believe how powerful this is. You cannot underestimate the power of shame. And the best way to understand the power of shame is to just be honest with yourself. Because we all got it, and it all works what we're doing at any given time. And the more that you understand that, the more you can understand what's going on with these kids.
The National Center for Learning Disabilities, they have a wonderful board of directors. We have at least 2 individuals on that board, both of whom have dyslexia, and both of whom are former governors. Extraordinarily accomplished individuals, both of them dyslexic. And both have talked at length about the continuing sense, not just of frustration or it's not just memories of failure, but precisely a sense of shame. that is still remembered, classroom-based, other children around, a teacher, not being able to do what other children seem to be able to do so easily. It stays for a lifetime.
She would go to the grocery and she would get the wrong thing. She'd just think, well, that's what I deserve, that's what I'm supposed to do. She just had no self-worth because it was just shamed out of her because she couldn't crack the code, she couldn't learn, she couldn't do what everybody else was doing. The pain and shame that people feel, people talking about walking back into school and actually getting sick at their stomach, because they remember how painful it was and how hurtful it was.
Shame and avoiding embarrassment are at the heart of almost every story we get from adults who come into adult literacy programs. It runs the gamut from the mother who receives notes from her children's teacher but tosses them in the waste can because she doesn't want to admit to her children that she can't read the notes that are coming from the teacher. The truck driver who goes to a colleague and says, I can't read Joe's writing, can you tell me what this note says? The person who never fills out a questionnaire at work but says, well, I didn't have my glasses today, I need to take this home, and takes it home and has his wife read it to them and then comes back with a filled out form the next day to work. These stories recur over and over and over.
Pro-literacy, by the way, for those of you not familiar with it, is the largest adult literacy organization on the planet. Right? So they serve the entire world, work with the United Nations, but have a big presence in the United States. So I'm going to say a couple more things about shame and then pivot off of this because most of us can identify with what a bad feeling shame is, right? Who wants that? But there's another, this is not just a, isn't it terrible they feel bad? There's a deeper cognitive meaning to this, right? The shame itself is learning disabling. And so we've got to see the shame not just as an unfortunate emotional variation in the child, but as a fundamental learning disabling process happening in the child.
And I don't like reading out loud. I'm embarrassed.
Being asked to read out loud in front of a class, which is a very typical elementary school reading activity, can be a terribly humiliating situation.
My teacher asked me to come into the front of class to read a book, and everybody was staring at me, and I got real nervous because I didn't want to mess up or anything. And then I started reading, I started messing up, and I just couldn't help it, and everybody started laughing at me and stuff. So.
Like the teacher would ask me to read something, and I would read it, and I get a wrong word, or I go too slow, and they make fun of me.
I kept messing up on the words and people kept laughing at me.
They said that you don't know how to read, but you will be able to learn how to read. You can learn.
They always laugh at me if I get messed up on words. It makes my heart drop. And it seems like they're not my friend no more. Ever since they're in the comfort reading principle. And they made fun of me and stuff, so I just never really liked reading after that.
The kids keep this secret. One of the most amazing things to me in my interviews with kids and teachers was that I would interview teachers and we'd have a little bit of a dialogue and talk about the shame and whatever, and the teachers would say, well, none of that going on in my class. I'd interview those kids and it would take a while, and then they'd pop forth and gush with just how powerful this is for them and the lengths to which they go to avoid it being known, the degree to which they hide it, the degree to which they keep it secret from their parents and from their peers and from their teacher. So for example, a lot of kids would say, their tactics range from the teacher's about to call on me, so I'm going to go to the bathroom, I'm going to drop my pencil so their heads go scanning by while I'm not visible, I'm going to start a fight, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get off the hot seat on this, right? When I'm taking a test and I can't read the words that are in that test, I'm going to get an F and be happy with that F, but rather than tell the teacher I need some kind of more time because I can't read it that well. I'm slow reading, right? It's just amazing. there's a number of consequences to this, and we talked a little bit about the mind shame. I want to play two more pieces to this before we go on to what I'll call the brains challenge and the history of the code.
Shame starts out as a physiological reaction. What it does first is it turns off whatever thinking had been going on before. We call it a cognitive shock. Nobody can think clearly in a moment of shame. After that physiological shock of shame hits, we then begin to think about what triggered it.
When you stop and think about what you're doing, try and analyze as you're going along, where are my areas, what am I processing, how much am I getting out? It all breaks down.
And I'm like, oh, I hope I don't screw up. Then I'm thinking about how much I'm going to screw up. And then I'm not really thinking about their reading.
You see them with a face of interest, track lookless, eyebrows down, eyes focused, looking like this, head forward. Then you see them slump for a moment when they can't get something. And then they're going to have one of a number of reactions to shame.
It basically takes the cognition hostage, paralyzing the child.
Well, it's a very maladaptive feedback cycle that you approach a task with anxiety because of concerns about your own performance. That distracts from your attention, your ability to focus on and process the information that's being provided, which impairs your performance more, which increases your anxiety. And this cycle continues to amplify itself.
If you're trying to understand what you read and you have interference from any source, it can be difficulty in recognizing words, it can be emotional reaction that keeps you essentially off task or inhibits the understanding and the attention, especially the attention that you're trying to devote.
So, for example, the ability to process what the text is, to see the letter and recognize it, to be able to translate that into a sound, to understand that sound is part of other sounds that are going to form words. As those words are embedded in sentences. These are all complex cognitive intensive tasks for children. If they're distracted by the feeling that they cannot do the task well, they're saying to themselves at the same time, I'm not good at this, I don't like this is not fun. Other children do this better than I do, I'm never going to learn it. All that talk and that emotional arousal is taking up what people call M space or cognitive space in the task. And when that happens, those distractions diminish the child's ability to actually do the task that they're now struggling with.
Again, that goes on. But you get the point, right? That what I'm saying is that this emotional arousal, as he just called it, it isn't just an unfortunate emotional event. It's a fundamentally cognitively learning disabling process. Right? So we've got to think about the emotional side of reading in a different way. I call this the downward spiral of shame. And though they haven't got to the level of reading with the neuroscience, with the brain scans yet, because the speed that the brain is involved with reading is too fast for our technology yet. But we can see it in math. We can see in math through brain studies that once somebody gets anxious, the math anxiety is popped up, it actually distracts and consumes their brain power in a way that makes it harder and harder for them to learn that. Right? We know that at the math level. Here's how it works at the reading level. So first of all, there's ambiguity overwhelm. What I mean by that is there's just overwhelm with confusion. That causes a flow stutter, meaning if they were reading along and all of a sudden they got confused, they stutter, they stop, they hesitate. This causes them to feel shame. This is from an affective neuroscience. Any impedance to the affective interest triggers shame. So in this sense, I'm using shame in a neuroscience sense. The shame is dissipated. Once the shame starts to occupy the mind's attentional space is going to where the shame state is, right? So it's dissipating the attention that could be used to do the reading work. This entrains the mind. Entrainment meaning that it's in this step, automated flow. It breaks that automation down. This causes a dropout in the attention on the task of reading, which is very frustrating, for which provokes a self-consciousness. child recognizes that here they are again. It's frustrating. They blame themselves. The more they blame themselves, the easier it is for the shame. If you don't blame yourself for something, that's one of the reasons they come up with these inventions. I'm not smart, I'm stupid, I'm whatever. Because those things stop them from blaming themselves, which stops the shame trigger, right? So when the shame triggers, they want to avoid the shame, right? So they develop the self-image, like I said, I'm stupid, I'm not stupid. They come up with some way to escape the shame that infects their self-talk, how they talk to themselves, about being a learner, all of which causes them to want to avoid the learning. So this shame arousal is a fundamental learning disabling dynamic. It's happening in children en masse, in reading and math. Just to put this in context, what I'm going to say is that I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so, 40 minutes, and I'm going to get two different parts. One part is going to be establishing enough history about how this code got to be a mess, how it got to be the way it is today. It didn't fall off the tree. There's a historic story to how English comes to be the way it is. It's one of the most fascinating stories that very few people know. So I'm going to share a little bit about that. And then after that, with this background that is talked about, readiness, confusion, right, the language, all these various things that make reading difficult, we're going to take a dive into the brain. How does the brain fabricate this experience? And then with that, all that as background, I'll go on to show you where we're heading with all this, what we're going to do with this, and how we plan to move this forward in your area, and for those of you that are interested, how you might participate in it, okay? So, probably this is an hour of video, so I got to compress it. So I'm going to say that by saying, first of all, the power of writing. You could say that in some respects, this code, writing, the idea of writing code, is the most powerful invention in the entire history of human invention. There is nothing that has more influence over our daily lives. It's more than gasoline, it's more than everything else. We take it for granted because it's everywhere, like the one guy was saying. But nothing has been more powerful in terms of lifting civilization, right? And in terms of exercising the mind from the way that it used to be 5,000 years ago to the minds that we have today. It is the most powerful invention in the history of history. One of the most interesting things about this is that you probably know the story of Moses and the Ten Commandments, right? Everyone knows about that story? Turns out that when the archaeological linguists are looking to trace back the origins of the alphabet, they actually converge into the same area, right, and into the same historical window that the Ten Commandments come from. And I'm not trying to get into any religious thing here. What I'm saying is that the power of the alphabet and the power of modern religions are linked in this really deep way. It is the very heart of the people of the Word, right? Both in the Israeli and later Christian tradition all come from the power that came from being able to write words, to be able to have ability to exchange words that didn't end and die with breath. They could stay and survive. There's another interesting part about this. After the alphabet gets established with the Hebrews, right, and it becomes the basis of their traditions and life and Bible and so forth, the Phoenicians pick it up. It was a big empire at the time, right? And the Phoenicians bring the alphabet to the Greeks. This is at the time of Homer, right, the archaic Greeks, right? And within 150 years of them getting the alphabet, the entire Greek society transforms from the archaic Greek to the classical Greek. Plato, Socrates, science as we understand it, all explodes as the alphabet becomes this tool that changes how society works and how minds work. So the whole history of history in Western world is connected to this. People have done studies, for example, that show that the difference in the cognitive capacities and cognitive styles of people that are from the East and from the West in the world can be rooted and connected to how the writing systems of the different worlds format the brain to function. It's so powerful. I mean, we take it for granted, right? But it's so powerful. It's the most powerful invention. Now, the other thing that's important here is that the Renaissance and this birth of science, as we understand it, was made possible because of the printing press. But you can't make a printing press for 20,000 Chinese characters. You need a small set of elements that you can combine, right? And that's what the alphabet represented. A small set of elements that can be combined to represent anything, right? Very powerful. Here's where the problem comes in. Up until this point, throughout the Greek use, the Hebrew use, the Greek use, the Phoenician use, and even the Roman use, the alphabet was phonetic.
I think it was much easier to read and write in the 8th century BC than it is today.
That laugh gets me every time, right? Because he's talking about what we're talking about. And this is this historian at Harvard who studies the origin and emergence of writing.
The earliest phonetic alphabet does not have vowels in the writing system. Only the consonants are written.
In the Semitic language and in the Arabic language, you have, which is in a form of Semitic language, but in Arabic and Hebrew, the consonants actually help define the morphemes.
The consonants, which are the shapes that we give to the breath. The B, the but, the cut, duh, what.
When the Greeks become exposed to the alphabet through their contact with Phoenician traders, they inherit an alphabet that's about 17 symbols. Those 17 symbols worked for the people who were using them. They were sufficient to make a clear, legible, written record of that language. But for the Greeks, 17 symbols wasn't enough. They needed extra vowel sounds to be noted because their language depended on them.
So the Greeks actually add letters to the alphabet so that they build an alphabet that corresponds to all the sounds in their language, just like the Hebrews did, right? And up through the emergence of literacy in the pre-Dark Ages, right, through the Roman Empire, the rise of literacy, the power of literacy, and the spread of literacy was connected to the fact that learning literacy was phonetic. As Plato said in the Republic, once we could learn the letters of the alphabet, we could read. Because reading was just a case of saying each letter and blurring it into the next one. There was no internal assembly required. There was none of this confusion. The confusion is a consequence of what I call the first millennium bug. You guys remember the Y2K bug? So, just like the Y2K bug was born because a couple of programmers, a handful of programmers in the 1970s when they were writing code, didn't think that there would ever be a time that they had concerned themselves with beyond 1999. So in their little myopic world of thinking about coding things, they left out concern for anything after 1999. And this whole big monster mess came from that little mistake with the code. Well, the biggest part of the reading problem that's connected to all the confusion I talked about before is analogous to the millennium bug, the Y2K bug, in the sense that it's caused by a handful of programmers who didn't care about what they were doing, careless with what they were doing. So, again, to kind of simplify this process, the Roman Empire, when it dies out, it leaves the Roman Latin alphabet and writing system on the shores of all the places that it extended into, including in England and France and Germany, whatever, right? The Roman Empire dies away, but it leaves behind the elements of the church, and it leaves behind elements of a kind of international politics that's happening between the different parts of the world, what was the Roman Empire. And all of these people are speaking Latin and reading and writing in Latin. There is no English at this point. In the 50s, just to give you an example, in the 15th century, only a few hundred years ago, it's estimated there were 5,000 people in the world that could read and write English. Compare that with 1 billion today, right? Or 1 billion aspirants anyway. So, as the Roman Empire died and left this language, as the individual countries spun up, England, Germany, France, and what have you, the people that were in power there were allegiant to the Roman alphabet and Latin system, right? Rather than adapt it to the language that was in the native area, they basically disconcerned themselves altogether with the local language. So the root of the story, this took a long time to tease out. I actually went to the person who wrote the most defining college book in the history of English, right? The English writing systems. And there was about 10 characters, and they all worked together over time. And they traced back the written English to the time of King Henry V, right? Who, in fact, he would say, I'll show this one clip real quick because it's fun.
The person who had the single most influence on the English language was not Shakespeare, it was William the Conqueror.
William the Conqueror. Why? Because English had begun to develop a writing system, and then the French invasion came in, and the official language of England for 300 years was French and Latin. English wasn't considered the language of peasants. We weren't going to make the writing system work for them. We didn't care about them. We cared about the people in power, the people in the church, the people in politics, the people with money, right? They all spoke Latin. They're French, the official languages of England. And it wasn't until King Henry V was trying to do his wars with France and everything else, he needs money. So he develops a way of sending people back into England, to the nobles of England, to gather money. But he's got to be able to communicate what he wants to them. So they start to develop this kind of dictation system of being able to encode what the king is saying so that somebody can be trained to read it to the nobles to get their money to support the king's wars. Right? So these scribes are the ones that said, well, wait a minute, there's all these sounds in English that we don't have letters for. Right? So we don't want to add letters to the Roman alphabet, that would screw that up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this letter and this letter, stick them together and make up for that sound. Right? And so this whole mess of English is an outgrowth of a handful of scribes, a dozen scribes working for King Henry V, who didn't speak English themselves, who didn't care about English, who were developing a system so the king could get money from the nobles who couldn't read. Just as it was coming up and starting to get stable, before it got developed and thought through, the printing press came in and froze it in place. At the time that the printing press came in, the printing press was coming from North Country, from the Danes and others in Northern Europe, and they had a different alphabet use than the English did. The English had developed a couple of special symbols to help differentiate, like the thorn and a bunch of others. Bottom line is that when the printing technicians came in to set up the printing shops, they didn't have the fonts that were necessary for English. So they said, to heck with those letters in English. So the point is that there's a series of historical mistakes and accidents that took the Roman Latin alphabet and manually mapped it over to England and then froze it in that state, and that's been that way. Probably the best person who's ever worked on this was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin stuck his head in this space and he said, you know, whole population's intelligence is being harmed by how messy this system is. And so he developed and invented a whole new alphabet system, Benjamin Franklin did. He's the one that convinced Noah Webster, right, to get on with spelling reform, right? There were attempts that were made over the past 200 years to fix English, right? First it was Webster and Franklin. All this stuff is in much more detail on the website because a lot of people are interested, a lot of people are not interested in the history. I think it's fascinating. It's a kind of a lens to which you can see a lot of the other things about history looking through this. But anyway, these people tried to fix the English language. And it culminated in 1906 when people like Mark Twain, right, the who's who of English brain power across the Atlantic and in the United States, the head of Collier's, the head of the encyclopedias, the dictionaries, Webster's descendants, they all came together and they said, we got a plan to fix English. We started working to fix those things. It was a multi-generational plan. We're going to have the people that write textbooks, the people that write encyclopedias, the people that write dictionaries, they're all going to start these little tweaks to the spelling system, and over a generation or so, we're going to have it fixed. Well, one of the people who were working on this project happened to have a friend by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. So he went to Theodore Roosevelt in the White House in 1906, and he explains to Roosevelt what he's doing. Roosevelt had grown up ashamed of his mind because of the spelling problem, so he immediately identified that this is a great idea, and issued an order from the President of the United States to the Office of Printing for the United States that you will now print everything according to these spelling conventions. Right? Well, the people in Congress that were against Roosevelt turned it into this big, ridiculed war mess, not unlike the Republicans roasting Obama or the Democrats roasting Bush. And so the whole attempt to fix the code went down in political flames with this big stink on it because of the way it was politically handled in 1906. So the reason I say all this is when you talk about what is it that's going on in these children, they are the victims of this entire history of negligence and carelessness about this fundamental technology that changes the entire shape and function of their minds. And by the way, having been a computer programmer and working in Silicon Valley, like I said, if some programmer had come up with a code like this, he would never work again. There's no way in the world we would let any machine that we build work with a code that's as so mangled and confused and corrupt as the code we have to force our kids to learn every day. Okay, I wish I had more time for all that. That's a lot of fun for me. Anyway, so now we go to the brain's challenge. And then after this, I'm going to show you the magic ladder parts. So as I mentioned in the early part of this, one of the important distinctions about understanding what reading is that reading is this projector. It's like there's this projector in the mind that's taking these letters, right, mapping them to sounds, assembling the sounds, get to words that can be recognized, right? So that those words create this stream in the mind that you can listen to or pay attention to or comprehend as if somebody was talking. Do we all get that? Any questions about that? Okay. So then how does the brain do that? Well, first there's elements.
The brain comes equipped to say a word without having to have conscious awareness of each individual sound. But when you're going to use the alphabet principle and code that word with letters, then you do have to have conscious awareness of the sounds. You can learn to talk relatively well without becoming that phonologically aware, without really needing to break the sounds down in your mind. It's only when you get reading that you must become aware that we're reading a smaller unit.
We know that it takes initially a clear understanding of the language we hear is composed of smaller sounds. These are called phonemes, smallest unit sound. And people say, sure, cat has 3 sounds. I can ask people all the time how many sounds they hear in big or cat, and I'll say 3. But They don't. You don't hear three sounds in a cat. I don't hear three sounds in a cat. Our kids never get any practice with the sounds of the cat because nature has given us an oral language that allows us to communicate rapidly. So that when I say cat, I don't say cat. What the hell is a cat? When I say it's cat, the minute I start to say cat, the ad and its sound co-articulate or bundle together and come out of you as one pulse of sound. Functional awareness is much more difficult because you don't hear the sound. And the brain has to pull from that one verbal or acoustic bundle the three sounds because the ear won't. The ear never hears the individual sounds unless we spell them out.
One of the most interesting things about this, everybody's heard about phonemic awareness, what a big thing it is. Phonemic awareness is what you just heard from the czar of reading and the neuroscientist who's most the best in the country on the auditory components of reading, and as it relates to phonemic awareness, is that phonemic awareness, as we currently think about it and understand it, is completely artificial. Kids don't need it except to read, right? They need to have and they wouldn't need it except to read English, right? They need to be able to map these letters to discrete little sounds so they can be assembled in the mind. If they don't do that, they don't have enough sounds. It's like the piano, remember the piano metaphor I used? So if some of the keys are missing, then it can't play the music right? The phonemes are the keys. We talked a bit about vocabulary. And with letters, I mean, all these things are really long, but the thing about letters, in addition to what you heard the guy say about the fact that letters change their position and shape, and yet they're supposed to still stay the same, one of the things that shows up about kids early on is that kids have real trouble with what's called object impermanence, right? Which is that they want to label something and that's the way it is. That's a chair. It can't be something different when you turn it in a way. It's got to be the chair, right? And so they're wired up from the beginning when they see a letter to associate it with a sound. We teach them with mobiles and everything else, the ABC songs, etc., right? But every time we teach them to have this hard association between a letter and its letter name, we're setting them up for confusion because it doesn't work that way. So the other thing about letters is that there's no time in nature where human beings ever had to focus their eyes in these one little bits at a time. So there's a completely artificial process to visual focusing, right? To what's called the foveal field dynamics, which we don't have time to go into, and with respect to the way that letters represent sounds, the phonemes, right? Big problems there. As this little image is showing, what the brain is doing is picking up on graphemes and morphemes. You understand morphemes, right? Cluster units of letters that represent semantic units rather than phonological or sound units, right? So there's morpheme and graphemes, but the letter that's coming in of a word you're reading can't be directly mapped to a sound. It's got to be held up in the air while you figure out some more things to figure out whether that thing is this thing or that thing. You know what I'm saying? A letter's sound variable is a mystery at the time that you read it until you read further down the word, sometimes further down the sentence, right? Take the difference between the I and the word live or live, right? You can't tell which I that is until you put the word live in a context, right? Exactly. So there's many cases where what that says is for the first time in the history of the human brain, it's got to take a lot of information and store it, and then work out which of these patterns it is in time to put forth a word into the stream of consciousness at the rate that we're used to speaking. This is called automaticity, the assembly of it all.
It's an enormous task just to get started, just to go to square one to be able to use the machine, so to speak. In this case, reading and writing.
Writing is its own form of language. And we know this if we learn how to read a foreign language, that you might have no idea of the sound, but you can learn to decipher that code.
On the other hand, you can learn to hear a language and speak it without ever really knowing how it's spelled or how it looks on a page. Connecting those two codes is a third operation. So we have writing as one code that you can read. We have sound as a code you can understand. And then we have making a relationship between writing and sound. And that, again, is not a natural relationship. It's a learned relationship. What has to happen is your phonological processor, your orthographic processor, your meaning processor, and your context processor all have to work in concert to identify the written word.
How do we take something that has so many variables, so many possible connections, common code options, and do it without having to think about it? How do we turn this complicated set of relationships into a skill that can be run, in effect, as though it was a computation? The key is that, of course, what we're really doing is we're taking something that is a nightmare for computation, and yet we have to turn it into, as we mature, both as language users, but also as readers and writers, we have to automatize it so that we don't have to think about those details.
Accuracy and authenticity, or accuracy and fluency with code, enables comprehension.
Laboratory data has underscored the importance of authenticity. That is, the importance of being able to recognize the letters, recognize the words, recognize that, so that you can attend to their use. Right? Really quickly.
The problem with automatization is that at any step, if you've got to slow down a step, if any piece of that enterprise has a lock, or you can't hold enough of the information, the whole house of cards falls apart.
I'd like to play that out further, but his point there at the end is that anything that causes this assembly to kind of stutter or break, or start to erode, erodes the whole attentional dynamic of staying in the flow of this. Right? So there's another component to understanding how the brain reads that's really important, and that's called synchrony. I had a conversation with a neurophysicist in Israel who's behind a body of work called asynchrony. Basically says that, and she's got the laboratory evidence to back it up, that the problem with dyslexics and slow readers, right, is that there are different parts of the brain that have to coordinate in real time. Just like dancing, right? All these different parts have to work together just right, at just the right time, at the right rate. That it's a breakdown in their synchronizations that's causing this problem. Here's an example of that. So here you see what would happen if you distort out of time sync the visual elements of color or sound, and how cacophonous or unintelligible it quickly becomes once the elements are not synchronized. You get the point. Okay, so the bottleneck to reading, one of the things that we're spoken about with authenticity is that the laboratories that have done the most work in this have shown really clearly that comprehension is inversely related to how much brain or attentional power is being used to decode. The more that the brain's trapped at word recognition, the less that there's brain available to comprehend what's being recognized. Does that make sense? So word recognition is the main bottleneck.
Even if we teach awareness of phonology and phoneme, grapheme correspondence as well, the hard part is getting us to get up to speed.
The longer it takes you to read something, the more memory and more attention it's going to require. We've got kids who, on the struggling side, hesitant, mispronounce. It takes them so long to read a passage, they can't even remember what the heck they read after a sentence, much less the passage.
Working memory really is a fundamental limitation. And so I think we see this all the time in kids who are having a hard time decoding. Their comprehension is abysmal often, because by the time they finally decode everything, finally struggle their way, fight their way through to that last word, it might be minutes. since that first word's been decoded, that word has long since departed working memory.
One of the things that's important to understand about attention when it comes to comprehending reading is that our attention to language, the way that we comprehend language, is formatted around the pace of language. Let me give you an example of that. How many understood that? How about that? You got that one down? Doesn't drag on, doesn't it? Spoken language has a narrow temporal profile. Intelligibility depends on speed. So what that means is that our ability to understand language is directly connected to how it flows, the rate that it flows at. If it doesn't flow fast enough, right, or it flows too fast, it's outside the temporal window of intelligibility to our mind. And what that means is that for reading to work, reading's got to produce words. The decoding and word recognition mechanism has to produce words at a rate that's roughly approximate to the rate that we're accustomed to listening to words in the natural world. If it doesn't, just like we have problems here, we'll have problems keeping our attention on it and it'll break down. And that's what you hear with struggling readers. They run out of attention. They can't stay with the pace. They can't hold it together in their minds. Let me give you a sense of what we're talking about from a processing point of view.
There's lots and lots of words and lots of speech sounds that are different only in terms of one or two acoustic features. And so obviously those acoustic features are really important. This is your dad, you know. You are bad. Those are very similar words. They mean completely different things, but they really only differentiate bad and dad are completely the same, except at the very onset, whether you put your mouth together, your lips together at the front or at the hard palate. Bad, dad, and acoustically, they're almost identical. The whole word is identical, except for about the first 30 or 40 consonants.
So, what that says is that in order for the brain to be able to track and understand our spoken language, it's paying attention to differences that are happening in fractions of a second. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to tell the difference in those words. Right? So in order to read, we have to stay up at a speed that's approximating this. Yeah? When you listen to a reader who's struggling, the start-stop hesitation in their stream is directly connected to their brain getting lost in a fog, trying to figure their way into word recognition before their attention breaks. That is their attention breaking down because it took them too long to resolve the confusion and get to word recognition. So their whole in and out stuttering is directly connected to the problem of decoding this code mess. Let me talk about how fast this has to happen.
I'm mainly interested in finding out what's going on inside the head of people who are reading and understanding text. I think what I'm looking for doing is reflecting the moment-to-moment processing that people are engaging in. In silent reading, you typically move your eyes about every 250 milliseconds. Okay, that's about the average fixation time of the eye. But there's a lot of variability around that. Sometimes it's as short as 100 milliseconds, sometimes it can be as long as 500 milliseconds. And the variability is being largely driven by things related to how easy or difficult it is to process the word that you're looking at.
In other words, how the eyes are actually tracking and taking longer or being faster, right, in their movements around, depending upon how confusing the word recognition process is. You can see it in the eyes.
Well, word is hard to look at a very low frequency, unfamiliar word. The eyes will systematically remain on that word longer. Will also more likely make a second fixation on the word before moving on. Whereas a very high frequency familiar word may only need one relatively shorter fixation. Like I said, the average is around 250, but there's lots of variability in how long the eyes are there being driven by, the difficulty of encoding the information. In oral reading, the eyes tend to fixate a bit longer, but there are places where the eye sort of pauses to not get too far ahead of the voice. Right? In silent reading, the average fixation duration is around 250 milliseconds. There's time that's involved in moving the eye from one place to another, so that the latency, just a simple motor reaction time of the eye, is about 150 milliseconds at least. So there's not a lot of time in there to process the information that you're looking at. Yet it's still interesting that, as I said, the eyes are being influenced by how hard or easy the word is to process.
We're talking about processing this code at a pretty good clip.
Yeah.
Actually, we can think about runtime, just all automatic, and on average, so many milliseconds per letter in the sound or the thing doesn't work.
That's right. It's all happening very fast at an unconscious level. I suspect that most letters that are in your sort of foveal zone, or the area right around your fixation, are probably being processed pretty much in parallel. So I don't think of them as, one 25 millisecond, another 25 milliseconds, but averaged over them, it's going to be about 25 milliseconds. Very fast, staggeringly fast.
25 milliseconds. When you break the timing down of the language stream and you look at the eyes, a good reader is moving through the letter sound confusion in reading at the rate of about 25 milliseconds, right? That's 40 letters per second, right? It's just moving fast, right? In terms of getting through the confusion, in order to learn to read, the brain has to, what I call disambiguate. Disambiguate is a term that's used in computer art for how a computer solves a problem of ambiguity. There's too many possibles. How do you get to the one that's right? It's called disambiguation. That's the heart of the challenge of learning to read. It's not about decoding. Decoding is a word that, like a motor uses decoding, right? There's a code that comes in, code that comes out. And there's a simple correspondence, but this code is confused. The challenge in the brain isn't decoding letter into sound. It's figuring out which sound goes with which letter under what circumstance, right? It's an entirely different thing. And I've talked to, I'm going to skip over this part now to move on to the magic letter part of this talk, but that if you were to look at the heart of the problem that kids are faced with, it's a problem of getting through this confusion fast enough for their attention to stay engaged with the flow of meaning, so that the word recognition feeds into the flow of meaning so they can sustain their engagement. And that the bottleneck in the process is the time it's taken the brain to work through the code confusion before it breaks down. And that the consequence of all this is the more that it breaks down, and again, the speed with which they can work through the confusion is related to their early life learning trajectories, their confidence, their frustration tolerance, all kinds of variables, right? If they can work through it fast enough, then they get better and better. They have what's called Matthew effects, and they spiral up to get better and better. If they don't, they have what we call the downward spiral of shame, right? Where because this thing is so difficult, because it's not working, because it's stuttering, it's arousing all this emotional stuff. The emotional stuff's interfering with their ability to do it, making it worse to do, therefore causing them to have more shame, therefore the shame causing them to have more greater difficulty doing it, and they just spiral out. There's so much more of this that